Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Good to see you here today. Hi, everyone. Good to see you. Just going to wait until the number of attendees settles out just a little bit, and then we'll get started. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Gail Angelado, and I'm part of the Native Plant Connections team that is putting on this series of webinars. Just want to let you know that we have set up today's meeting as a webinar so that chat has been turned off, but the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen has been enabled. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question, please take advantage of the question and answer feature. If somebody types in a question and you had the exact same question as they had, you can always upvote it so that it'll make that question rise to the top of the list. I also wanted to let you know that you have the ability to turn your closed captioning on or off by using the CC button, which you should also see towards the bottom of your screen. If this is your first time at a Native Plant Connection webinar, I wanted to let you know that it's a series of webinars highlighting cutting-edge research surrounding key issues specifically focused on serving the needs of native plant growers. Past webinars have touched on the topic of preserving genetic diversity in native plants. Future topics will include native plant propagation. And today we're lucky to have Dr. Baldos talking about native plant design, installation, and maintenance. If you're interested in attending a future webinar, I wanted to let you know that next month will be Dr. Sandra Wilson from the University of Florida, specifically talking about native plant propagation, including seed propagation and tissue culture, really helping to address some of the supply chain issues that we have in the native plant market today, and the need to scale up production with proper propagation methods. If you're a native plant grower, perhaps you also took our survey of native plant growers in the US way back in January of 2023. I wanted to let you know that nearly 400 growers responded to our survey trying to understand what it is that native plant growers need and want in terms of research and extension. I do want to thank our funders, the USDA NIFA Specialty Crop Research Initiative, and to let you know that in the August webinar, we'll be presenting the results of that survey. So what we're trying to do here as part of the larger Native Plant Connection program is to chart a path forward for sustainable native plant production here in the US. And if you've been to one of the webinars in the past, you know that I've tried to choose native or endemic plants representative of where our speakers are coming from for each of the past webinars. So today, in honor of Dr. Baldos, I wanted to talk about La'u Kama'aina, Hawaiian native plants. And if you're interested in Hawaiian native plants, if you've ever been to the lovely Bishop Museum in Hawaii, I really want to give a shout out for the Hawaiian Ethnobotany database, which has a treasure trove of information on a variety of plants of historical and cultural importance to Indigenous Hawaiians, including Chenopodium and rubus species, where the Chenopodium leaves were consumed, edible by Indigenous Hawaiians, and Hawaiian raspberry, both the wood and the berries were consumed as well. And if you're interested in learning more about La'u Kama'aina, I will drop the link to the Bishop Museum Ethnobotany database into the chat once I hand things over to Dr. Baldos. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Baldos today, who will be talking about planting design and establishment of native ornamental landscapes. Dr. Baldos is a researcher in ornamental horticulture at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. His research interests include native Hawaiian plant materials development for landscape and ornamental use, the screening and selection of non-invasive ornamental species, and development of sustainable ornamental plant production and landscape management practices. He studied the development of propagation, establishment, and weed management protocols for a number of native Hawaiian ground covers. He studied seed dormancy, smoke-stimulated germination, and seed harvest timing of pili grass, as well as weed management and sports turf. And with that, it is my great pleasure to hand it over to you, Dr. Baldos. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to talk to this webinar. Okay, let me share screen. All right, everybody's seeing the
Yes.
video? Okay, all right. Okay, so today I would like to share with you my experiences in terms of designing and establishing landscapes that use native ornamentals. So today's talk, we're going to be, it's sort of like a crash course in landscape design and establishment. So first off, we're going to talk about the 3 phases of landscaping, and then look at what your landscaping objective, if you're trying to mimic a naturalistic landscape or maybe something that's more, I guess, curated or more, I guess, architectural. And then we'll talk about different elements and principles of design in terms of landscape plants, also different categories of landscape plants based on how it's used in the landscape, some steps in designing a garden, and then the last part is some notes on planting and establishment. Okay, so what are the 3 phases of landscaping? So the 3 phases of landscaping are the following. So you have design, next would be installation, and then next would be maintenance. In the design phase, this is where you do your site study. So you take a look at what's existing in your site, what plants are there, what you want in terms of improvement, maybe add more plants or add more amenities. And then from there, you analyze that and create irrigation, planting, and also circulation plans. After the design phase, the next phase is the installation phase. So this involves activities like leveling, earth moving, installation of irrigation, and also planting of your native plants. And then the last phase of landscaping is what we call maintenance. So this is done in order to keep it faithful to the original design intent. Usually, the last phase is often neglected, and that's why some landscapes fail because there's no follow-up on maintenance. Okay, next would be your landscaping objective. So how are you going to landscape or how are you going to use native plants in a landscape? Are you going to design in a naturalistic way, trying to mimic nature, or are you going to do a more manicured or curated type of design? So each of these objectives will have its own challenges in terms of design, installation, and maintenance. Let's look at the different objectives, I guess, in more detail. So if you're going to do naturalistic landscapes, this is a little bit more, I guess, well, natural. So plants are more dispersed. There's a lot more diversity, I guess, in terms of plants in a per unit area. And it's more dynamic. And if you're just trying to make it as natural as possible, you're probably going to have minimal, what do you call it? You're just going to let it run its course. So it's a little bit more dynamic and it changes over seasons and time. I guess in terms of weed control, naturalistic landscapes is a little bit more challenging, especially if you're planting and establishing them by direct seeding. So in those cases, you're using a bunch of different species. And if you're using a variety of species during seeding, then in terms of your weed control arsenal, herbicides may be used, but it's more of like a spot spray or in some cases, maybe just hand weeding would be the way to go, because it's, yeah, you have a variety of species in there. And in terms of maintenance, it's also a little bit more challenging than something that's more organized, because, yeah, there's different species in a smaller piece of area. Okay, if you're doing manicured blocks of plantings, so these are described as landscape designs that have mass planting. So you have a block of single species that's planted together. So these types of landscapes are more static, and they are maintained in such a way so that they're faithful to the original design. So if it maintains its like block or shape. Weed control is a little bit easier because you're dealing with monocultures in a particular area. So they're easy to plant and establish because, yeah, it's the same plant in a small in a chunk. And yeah, a little bit easier to maintain because they're in blocks. So regardless of your landscaping objective, both types will make use of elements and principles of design. So this is where we go now into some basic concepts of designing with plants. Okay, so what are some examples of elements and principles of design? Elements, we have form. We also have color, line, and texture. And then principles, examples of principles of design include contrast, scale or proportion, balance, rhythm or sequence, and also emphasis. So when you look at elements, it's basically the building blocks. So you have the building blocks of design, and then the principles are like the rules in which those blocks are arranged. Yeah. Okay, let's look at the elements of design with form first. So form is defined as the shape or a structure of a three-dimensional object. So in our case, so since we're focusing on plants, we're looking at the form of the plant. So some plants have round shapes, some have oval shapes, some have like square shapes, or some even have irregular shapes. And you can use form in a design to make to create interest. The next element of design is color. Color is defined as the visual sensation produced by different wavelengths of light. And color can be divided into three categories. The first one is what we call hue. So it is dependent on the wavelength. So for example, you have the yellow spectrum or the blue spectrum, the red spectrum or the orange spectrum. And then under hue, actually, you have two types of characteristics. You have value, which indicates the lightness or darkness of a particular color. And then you also have intensity, which defines saturation or brilliance. So how bright is it? Is it more of a dull green or a bright green color? The different aspects of color can be summarized into this illustration here, which I got actually as a screenshot in Google Slides. So this band over here is what is hue. And then we chose one color here, green. And value is basically the up and down portion here of this green, this range of green. So the topmost part is like the light green color, and then towards the bottom is more black. And then intensity, you have the left side, which has less green. It's more of a gray. So not saturated, but also it's more of a grayscale. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have very saturated green. So in a landscape, you can play with different types of colors to create contrast and interest. And in this case, so these are native Hawaiian plants that are planted together. These are dryland species. So you have a grass that's it's green during its vegetative phase, and during the dry season, it turns into this brownish color. And yeah, and that gives good contrast to some shrubs that are green all year round. So you can play between different hues, so brown and green, or you can play or experiment with different intensities of green. So you have dark green and light green altogether. So after color, you have line. So line is defined as delimiting the shape or the structure. So different types of lines include vertical lines, horizontal lines, diagonal, zigzag. These lines will dictate whether a design can be formal or more like leisurely. Usually, formal landscapes have this linear pattern. So you can plant a series of natives here to create line, or in some cases, if you want something that's more relaxed or more like leisurely, you make use more of curved lines, and yeah, you have plantings of natives that follow those curved lines. Okay, another element of design is what we call texture. So texture is the visual effect of the surface of plants or structures. So in terms of plants, we're looking at the leaf size and structure. Generally, we could divide plants into having a large leaf or rough texture, or something that's more like fine textured plant. So in this case here, on this picture on the right, we have a rough textured ground cover that's planted beside a fine textured grass. So that creates some contrast between the plantings. And you also have different textures in terms of like the shrubs that we have here. Okay, now let's go to the principles of design. So we talked about form, line, texture, and color. We'll talk about how we can use all of these elements to make a nice design. And these are the rules for the principles. So first principle of design is contrast. So contrast is basically a tool to gauge the relative difference between things. You can have contrast that can be gradual or sharp. So the one on top is planting of different native Hawaiian ground covers. Leaves are more or less the same size. There are some differences in color here, and you can see how gradual the transition is from the lower left to the upper right corner, wherein you're transitioning to a dark green to a light green, and then you have some like grasses here that are of a different texture. Contrast that with the picture at the bottom, wherein it's very distinct. You have a fine leaf textured plant here contrasted with a large leaf ground cover. Another principle of design is unity or harmony. So this is defined as a pleasing relationship of objects that make each component a part of a whole. The arrangement of these parts or materials will produce a single design. And how you achieve harmony and unity in design is you can repeat patterns or repeat plants and then create also dominance. So over here on this picture on the right, this is actually a green roof that's planted to a bunch of native Hawaiian plants. Here you have the same shrub, pohina-hina, planted at the edge here, and then at this inner circle here. And surrounding that inner circle is a bunch of carex, native carex that's planted, and some other sedge here, Mauaki-aki, another coastal sedge. And you can see how things are repeated here in this design, and that makes it unified or harmonized. Okay, so after unity or harmony, the next principle of design is scale and proportion. So scale and proportion is the relative size of objects or plants in reference to the human figure. So we can have designs that are more intimate in terms of the plants are maintained in such a way that they're proportional. They're kind of like lower, or you can reach it with with your hand. So this creates an intimate space on top, and then on the bottom you have a planting that's complementing a very large building at the back here. So these are blocks of native plants that are planted, and if you put a human in here, it's very grand. Yeah, so you can create different feelings based on scale and proportion of things. Another principle of design is what we call balance. So balance is the stability of a particular design. It gives an illusion or equilibrium around a real or imaginary central axis. Balance can be divided into two types of balance. You have symmetrical balance and also asymmetrical balance. Symmetrical balance is this picture on top, wherein if you put a line at the center, it's a mirror image of the other. And then asymmetrical design is probably just like a visual balance sort of thing. So there's going to be probably this axis over here is sort of like balancing the composition. Okay, another principle of design is rhythm or sequence. So you repeat patterns so that the eye follows the design. You can repeat the same type of plant, although, well, this is the same species. So this is Alahe'e, which is planted repeatedly in this building here to create rhythm. Although you can see that there's different forms, and the different forms basically means that they're genetically different from each other. And then lastly, in terms of principles of design, you have emphasis. So plantings that create emphasis focuses attention to a part of the landscape. And that makes the garden more personal and interesting. So in this case, on top, the emphasis is this fountain in the center. So the fountain is planted with some shrubs and ground covers. And then on the bottom picture, you have this variegated native that's planted to emphasize this tree over here. Okay, so those are examples of elements and principles of design. Now let's look at the different categories of landscape plants according to their use. So one use of a plant in the landscape is its use as a ground cover. So ground covers are low-growing plants that reduce maintenance and erosion. These are usually planted where grass is desirable but not suitable. So if you have an area that's like too steep, like this highway slope over here, or maybe the area is too small for grass to be established, then you establish ground covers there. Another type of category are edging plants. So these are low-growing plants that are used to define pathways and shapes of planting areas. So this is a variegated naupaka that's planted beside the road to define that roadway. Usually these edging plants are attractive, they're compact, and also tolerant of clipping. Another category of landscape plant according to use is the specimen plant. So a specimen plant is a plant that you plant, I guess, just by itself, because it has this special beauty or unusual quality that you want to exhibit. So you exhibit that alone. So by exhibiting it alone, you need ample space so that it will grow into its I guess full glory. So this particular plant here is a hala tree. So it's a pandanus tree that's planted as a specimen in the landscape here. So you can see there's enough space for it to grow. Then you have accent plants or focal point plants. So these are either one or more plants, so maybe up to 3 plants that you can plant in a garden to create interest. So you can use this in pairs, or like you can plant it in between 2 buildings to frame that building entrance, or maybe a gate. But these are sort of like, I guess you can equate that to like spice in cooking. So you want to add a little bit of accents or of accent in a landscape design to create more interest, but you don't want too much of it because it becomes too confusing. Then another category of landscape plant are barriers, hedges, and screens. So these are plants that provide security and privacy. If you have plants that are thorny, you can use those plants to deter trespassing. And then lastly, another type of landscape plant according to use is what we call foundation plants. So foundation plants are plants that are planted beside a building so that it helps anchor the building. So you have a transition from the ground to the building. So in this case, you have a bunch of native Hawaiian shrubs that are planted here so that, yeah, it's not like building and then ground already. So there's a visual transition. Okay, so now let's look at steps in designing gardens. So I've mentioned this in the design phase. So what you first want to do is you want to study the site, take a look at what resources are there, determine what one has, and also what type of improvement do you want in terms of landscaping. And then once you've done all this, then you create plans. In our case, since we're dealing with native plants, we're trying to figure out a good plant palette for a planting design. So if you're choosing plant palettes for a design, the most important thing is you choose the right plant and plant it in the right place. So choose plants that are adapted to a particular area. So if you are landscaping maybe a coastal area, then use coastal species, native species that occurs there as your plant palette. If you're landscaping something like a mountain area, then use plants that are adapted to that mountain area. Some species may be coexisting together. So maybe take a look at some plants that you have, native plants that you have that coexist together. They can do well as species that are planted together. So this particular picture on the left is a coastal species. So Elima, it's a Sida species, and then a Jackmontia. Usually you can find it naturally growing together along the beach, and you can create something like this in terms of having companion plantings. Something to think about, are you going to establish perennial plants or annual plants? So if you're going to do maybe a mix also, if you're planting annuals, maybe you should consider how it will persist in the landscape. Do you need to reseed it every so and so years or replant? As opposed to perennials where you can just plant them there and they'll stay there for a long period of time. Also consider maintenance. So this picture on the left shows you a badly maintained native plant. This is actually planted in I think in a roadway median strip. And I guess what they wanted to do is to keep it short. So they're just cutting it away. So I think in this case, this particular plant might not be the right plant in the right place. So maybe a more compact, slow growing plant might be more applicable to this median strip. Also try to know your planting distance when it's mature. Oftentimes, well, in some cases or in some projects, people just want something that's instant. So they plant things more densely. And eventually, once the landscape matures, people just you remove one plant over, well, basically trim it so that the density is a little bit less. Maybe this takes some education for clients. You just need to tell them that if you're planting a native landscape, it takes time for things to mature and grow. Also take a look at what the number of plants are needed in a particular design and also availability. I know there's an upcoming webinar that talks about propagation. So some plants may be not as available. So when you're speccing out plants in a design, make sure that that particular plant is available, because there are cases where in landscape architects, they spec out certain plants at a certain size, but the nurseries don't carry them. So yeah, think about that. This number also dictates the type of planting method that you're going to use. Either you're going to do direct seeding, hydroseeding, or planting transplants from plugs or gallon pots. So if you have availability, or if seed is abundant and cheap, then maybe direct seeding might be the way to go. If seed or planting material is not as available, then transplants or gallon pots might be more practical. Okay, let's look at site preparation next. So I guess in terms of the meat of the talk, this is what I want you to take home. Site preparation is very important because it helps reduce future weed problems. So because I'm more of a I have a background in weed science, so and weeds are actually a very important component of of a landscape, and they're constantly there. So if you want to reduce weed problems in the future, you need to prepare the site properly. You can do site preparation using the stale seedbed technique. If you guys are familiar with the stale seedbed technique, basically what you do is you have so example, you have a piece of land, you clear the debris, and then install irrigation, and the irrigation wakes up, or actually lets the weeds grow. And after the weeds have grown pretty good, before it seeds, you kill it with either chemical means like herbicides, or maybe weed mats, or maybe steam weeding. And then you do this several times. I would recommend four times, at least 4 times. And by that way, you're exhausting the weed seeds that are on the surface of the ground. So once everything on the ground, every weed seed has germinated on the ground, then you're ready to plant. So once it's ready like that, try to avoid cultivation. So you want to just, like, if you're going to establish by seeding, direct seeding, then you just sprinkle the seeds on top. No need for cultivation to happen. If you're doing transplants, then you just dig specific areas or holes for planting those transplant in. Because if you cultivate the whole area, then that brings up more weed seeds from the bottom of the soil surface, and that creates, you have more weed seeds germinating and you have weed problems. Another thing in terms of site preparation to do is to test for soil nutrients. So if your nutrients are adequate or inadequate, so you may need to amend the soil if needed. So the next couple of slides is showing you how we establish a native plant planting on the highway. So this was done like probably more than 10 years ago. So this is a highway planting that we wanted to convert into a native planting. Here you have a lot of non-native trees here, non-native grass. And the first thing that we did was to find the water source for irrigation. So irrigation is very important. after cutting all those trees, then the next phase is to clear all the debris because, well, this is a highway site, so there's a lot of trash in here. So we cleared all that up, and then installed irrigation, sprinkler irrigation to make the weeds grow. So you can see that the weeds are starting to grow. Eventually, they'll grow very lush. And then after they've grown lush, then you kill it with your weed control technique or of choice. So it could be a herbicide or could be something else. So you do this several times. So you flush it again. So you have the weed seeds growing again. And then by the fourth time, you end up with a ground that's almost weed free. So at this time, it's ready for planting. So let's look at different ways of planting or establishing natives. So you can go with direct seeding if your seeds are abundant, or hydroseeding. You can also use transplants by plugs or pots, or you can do a combination of both depending on availability of planting material. Okay, let's look at direct seeding or hydroseeding. So direct seeding just makes use of, well, seeds, and then you spread it all out to your planting surface. Hydroseeding is a specific way of direct seeding in which the seed is mixed in this tank of water filled with water and mulch and also tackifier. So mulch is in the form of newspaper mulch, and this is agitated with a pump, and then the pump basically sprays the surface, well, with the mulch and the seed together. So the goal for direct seeding and hydroseeding is to have a fast ground cover in order to reduce erosion and also to control weeds, so that you have your native plant establishing there, and you're sort of like shading out the other weeds in there. So this is a useful technique if you're establishing dominant ground covers like grasses or herbaceous ground covers. Maybe not as a good way to establish trees or shrubs, because trees or shrubs, you only need a couple of them in there. And if you do direct seeding, then weed control will be hard because, yeah, you only have trees and then you have blank spaces in between. When you're doing direct seeding, particularly if you're doing hydroseeding, try to take a look at the seed size. So if it's very, very tiny, like dust-like, then it might be okay to hydroseed it. If it's very large, then there might be a clogging up of the pump, or your seed might get damaged during the hydroseeding process. So this takes some experimentation. Another note on direct seeding, you may have seed dormancy issues. Ideally, you would like to have non-dormant seeds direct seeded because, well, they will germinate quickly and grow rather than if you're doing dormant seed. So if you have dormant seed, try to think about, well, study the species and see what type of treatments does it need to break dormancy. If it just takes a period of warm or warm dry storage, then that may be direct seeded. So you just apply the warm dry storage for a particular time and then they're out of their dormancy. But if it requires something like cold stratification or something else, then it might be better to establish it from plugs rather than direct seeding. Another important factor to consider when direct seeding or hydroseeding is availability of seed. So this is practical, or this makes sense if you have bulk cheap seeds, but if you only have a small amount of seeds, then that might not be the way to go. Also think about if you're doing a mix of hydroseeding species or maybe just one species at all. Whether you're doing a mix or a single species, if you're doing a single species, it's easier in a weed control sense because, well, if you're using herbicides, it might be useful because, like, say, for example, you're establishing a native grass. So you you may be able to spray a broadleaf herbicide there to kill the broadleaf weeds. If you're doing a mix, then you're limited to just either spot spraying in a certain area or even hand weeding. Another aspect to think about with hydroseeding is the irrigation. So during the direct seeding process, you want to make sure that the soil is moist so that it's suitable for germination. But take into account, so if you didn't prepare your field properly, then you may be growing some weeds there also, because the moist conditions are also favorable for weed seed growth. So this is why it's important to create a stale seed bed first before establishing if you're doing direct seeding. Okay, so that's direct seeding. The next phase or the next type of planting is using transplants from plugs or pots. So this is a practical way of establishing natives if bulk seed is not available, if your seed has some issues on dormancy, and if you're establishing non-dominant species like trees or shrubs that can be used as accents, focal points, specimens. So things that are not are only used a few times in the landscape. This is probably the way to go rather than direct seeding. Think about the spacing of each species. So maybe there are probably some established planting distances for certain native species. If you don't have any idea of how a particular native species should be planted, I guess, in terms of distance, try to take a look at what's out there, I guess, in a natural setting, and then see how things are spaced out. You don't want them to be planted too close that they kind of crowd out each other. If you're transplanting by plugs or pots, so if you are a nursery, then make sure that your scheduling is on point. You don't want the transplants you don't want the transplants to be sitting there for a long time, because there could be issues like root circling that can girdle the shrub or the tree species. So root circling, you have roots going around the pot, and if you plant those types of trees or shrubs, when they grow, those roots that are around will eventually girdle out the tree or the shrub, and that can cause death of the plant. You can also use a combination of both. So depending on the availability of seed and planting material, you can establish your ground cover first, and then eventually do the trees and the shrubs. So you're kind of mimicking ecological succession. So at first you want to establish ground cover. So these are your pioneer species. And then second it is to plant shrubs, and then lastly plant trees. So in this case, weed control will be easy at the beginning because you're only using one species, and you may have more tools in terms of weed control with using one species. And having a dominant ground cover will reduce weed issues. A downside or disadvantage of doing a combination planting is that it takes time. So you want to establish the ground cover first before establishing the other species in there. So it will take a couple of months. So this picture, the next set of pictures is showing you how we do this succession planting. So we established a stale seed bed in that highway site. We have since we don't have enough of the grass seed, the native grass seed that we're planting, we place them on top of the drip line, and then we grow them in rows. So eventually they'll grow like this. And then once it starts seeding, then we cut the seed heads and then place them into the middle area. Eventually that patch will become bigger and will become the dominant ground cover. And then once it's ready, then we mow them lightly. So basically a high mowing height so that we don't kill them. And then we plant the the shrubs in there, and the cut grass serves as mulch. So we planted shrubs here at the edges, and this is progression of those shrubs growing, and you still see the dominant grass over there. Then this is how it would look like in its full established look. So next would be establishment. So some notes on irrigation. So if you're direct seeding, you want to keep the site moist at first, and then you want to gradually establish the plant. So reduce the irrigation frequency so that you have less weed problems. I would also recommend doing deep watering rather than shallow and frequent watering to encourage deeper root growth. In terms of pest management, expect that monocultures will have more, I guess, more pest. It's more prone to pests than polycultures. I know there was a talk, I think a month ago or a couple of months ago, about genetic diversity within a species. Even within an individual level, there might be some individuals that are more susceptible to pests than others. So in terms of pest management, you need to have a toolbox in terms of your IPM approaches. So IPM is integrated pest management. So this is I guess an extreme example of pest susceptibility with different individuals. So we collected seeds of this is a Sida species, a native Sida species, and we planted them out, and we got very diverse forms. So we have large leaf forms that are not floriferous, and then floriferous ones. And while we were growing them, we found that certain individuals within that seed population are more prone to pests than others. So the leafy ones that don't have as much flowers are least susceptible to mealybugs compared to something that's very floriferous. So these are planted beside each other, and then the other one is not affected as much. So there's very few mealybugs in here, whereas the one next to it is like super infested with mealybugs. Okay, and then the last portion of this talk is talking about maintenance. So I've talked about this in the beginning, that maintenance is the most often neglected part of the landscape process. You cannot just walk away from your site once it's established, because eventually the non-natives will come back, especially if you're planting in an urban setting. Naturalistic landscapes also require it. So this can include deadheading, pruning, roguing, or weeding. Manicured landscapes will require regular pruning, mowing, deadheading to keep the plants in shape. When you're thinking about maintenance, think about how each species will persist. Maybe some species are more persistent than others. If that's the case, then the less persistent species may be replanted if you want to maintain the same intent in terms of your design. So if you're thinking about replanting, then you need to develop replanting schedules. Okay, so this picture here is basically the same site. This was taken last year, about 10 years after we finished our grant. So there's no irrigation, no maintenance at all. And as you can see, there are still pockets of natives in here, but for the most part, the whole landscape has been invaded with non-native plants. So yeah, think about that in terms of maintenance. So in summary, we talked about the three landscaping phases: design, installation, and maintenance. We talked about how native plants can convey different elements and principles of design, and how can we use that in terms of its function in the landscape. We also talked about the different objectives, whether you're planting a naturalistic or a manicured landscape. And I guess the most important thing here with this talk is that you need to prepare your site properly, and you need to maintain your landscape plantings so that it will persist over time. All right, I'd like to thank my old lab. Everybody has either retired or have gone to other positions. Most of this work was done in the DeFrank lab with funding from NRCS and the Hawaii Department of Transportation. So we also want to thank the Magoon Research Station staff and the person who was leading the way in terms of trying to introduce natives in roadways, Chris Dacus. So that ends my talk. So if you have any questions, let me know. This is my email, my website, and Instagram handle. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Baldos. You can't see everyone clapping, but we're all clapping for you, and some comments in the Q&A thanking you for the information. There's a question in the Q&A pod. Claudia is wondering whether or not the plants you're working with are native to the Hawaiian Islands before colonists arrived.
Yeah, so most of the plants that I work with are the ones that have been here or arrived here naturally. So with the 3 Ws, so wind, water, and wings. So yeah, but we have a law, actually we have a state law that incorporates both the native plants, so native meaning the ones that came here naturally, and also the indigenous plants that the native Hawaiians have brought in here. So we have a state law that requires the use of natives and also introduced by Native Hawaiian, the important crops that were introduced by the Native Hawaiians in state-funded landscaping projects.
Thank you. I had a question as you were going through the presentation, and it really has to do with the lack of uniformity in many native plants that are on for sale in ornamental marketplaces. I think that the historical focus for design, and I'm not a designer, so if I'm wrong, please correct me, is that there really is value in having uniformity among individual plants of the same species, cultivar selection. And with native plants, many of which have not been selected, or if they have, they've been lightly selected, you have a lot more variation in form, color, pest resistance, as you've shown. And I'm just wondering about the practical aspects of dealing with that lack of uniformity when you're working with native plants in landscape design and maintenance. If you have any, what do you tell the professionals that you work with about what to expect in terms of this lack of uniformity and how to deal with it?
For our case, I think there is, well, when I showed you that slide with the trees, I think folks are okay with not having that plant, but there's some differences in form. But we also have plants that we clonally propagate, so they make it uniform. So I think it depends on the design objective. If you're doing maybe shrubs, then that is more clonally propagated. Trees can be more seed propagated. In our case, in Hawaii, it's usually seed propagated, but it's not. I guess it's not as extreme as the picture that I've showed you. That a seed batch has like greatly different forms. So yeah, for the most part, it doesn't, like the uniformity issue, I don't see it much in established landscapes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great answer. There are 3 more questions that I'm working through. One, I also had the same question, whether or not you have recommendations for keeping invasive grasses or even just aggressive grasses that spread via rhizome from establishing around and in native grasses.
Okay, that's a good question. Like even like we have problems with Bermuda as well. So sometimes Bermuda grass, if it's there, it's very hard to control. So I think what you want to do is just to make sure that your site is well prepared, and you don't have spaces that those grasses will, those are niches, right? So if there's like a space that's available, then they'll invade. So yeah, just try to make sure that your native ground cover is well established. And if there's some invasives, or if there's are difficult to control non-natives around it, then maybe just make sure that, yeah, it doesn't spread into that planting. Maybe you can use something like a barrier, like a landscape barrier to prevent that, or you can just do herbicide application or whatever non-chemical weed control method you can. So just make sure that they're not going into your plantings.
Thank you. And I just want to thank you for the information you gave on site preparation. Very useful. I realize I skipped many of those steps, but I will not from now on. Another question about whether or not there are any differences to consider in terms of preparation, planting, and maintenance between your work in Hawaii and what folks may do here on the mainland, on the west coast of the mainland.
So different places will have different ways of prepping or planting or maintaining. So I guess a resource would be the university, right? So there are people who work in landscapes in different state universities in different states. So I would try and ask them in terms of they probably have recommendations on how to prepare the site that are very specific to that area. So I would go there and yeah.
Thank you for that. And Frederic, for your question, OSU is on the precipice of hiring an endowed chair in sustainable urban landscapes to really kind of shore up our research in that particular area. And then our final question for today, Rodolfo has a great question about whether or not you can plan for a landscape to be used as transition for later purposes, such as using livestock, putting livestock on that land, or attracting pollinators. I think when you talked about planting for succession, I think this is thinking about intentional succession of land uses.
Yeah, I think you can do that. Yeah, or practice garden rotation. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on the precipice of your vacation. I hope you have a wonderful vacation away. And thank you everyone who joined us today for this webinar. Give me about a week to close caption it, and it will be posted on our website, which once again, I'm dropping in chat. And please remember to mark your calendars for July 19th, when Sandy Wilson will be talking about native plant propagation. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye now.